podcast. Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. I can't wait for the screen to change. A little something special as I get a little bit fancier. I've wanted to do some things with the broadcast, and if the high speed will permit, hopefully there you go. I thought it was pretty appropriate since we were in Matthew to have Israel behind us. So what you're seeing is the western, well, not really the western wall, but you're looking down over the valley to that special gate. Now, the reason there are graves there is because Jesus talked about his entrance when he returns, and actually Muslims built their graves over that gate because they believed that the Messiah couldn't defile himself by coming back. At least that's the story. And so you're looking down over the valley, and you can see the Dome of the Rock there. That's not necessarily the greatest sight in the world, but you can see the wall there. And so I'm going to start using a background because we could be somewhere else, even as I'm sitting in my living room. And I thought that was really cool. And so I found some ways to do a few things that I hope will make the broadcast more interesting. We'll add a little bit to it, and we'll just have some fun with it. And so hopefully you feel free to comment. But there you are. We are going to be back in Matthew, and in the back you will have the land looking at you. So that works well. And we're going to get started here. But when I bring that up, you still can see the land and me. It's as if I was in Israel. I can switch backdrops in the future, but this is so appropriate for tonight. We're going to be looking at Jesus handling controversy, particularly in the second pericope. That controversy is going to continue after the second pericope of tonight, but it's going to begin in the first pericope of tonight. So why don't we get started and get cranking here. Let me switch this over. Let's talk about Jesus preparing for controversy. There's some preparation that goes on here. Now, if you're wondering where we're at, we are in Matthew 11. The last pericope of Matthew 11 begins with the words "at that time." That's what tells us a new topic is starting, a new section is topping. We have a sort of temporal phrase there that helps us with that whole thing. I'm going to answer that. Radical love, yes. About 11, 12 years ago, actually on my birthday, I was in Israel with a dear friend of mine, Mike Wingfield, who is writing a book, but he's done a lot of tours. He's an incredible prophecy teacher. But my wife continues to remind me that I did not take her like I was supposed to. I will save that for a special story sometime. A little involved, but she does remind me of it. She said if she got to go, she might leave me behind the next time. So that's an answer to that question. So you see at that time, Jesus is going to prepare for controversy. We're going to see that first. There's going to be a real intense thing that goes on. And that's what kind of tells us. Now, how does Jesus prepare for controversy? I'm going to slip here. Jesus prepares for controversy with prayer. He starts with prayer. Now, let's look at the prayer that Jesus offers as he's going to go into some battle around some issues pertaining to the law and to the Pharisaic tradition, or the roots of the oral law, the beginnings of the oral law. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you've hidden these things from the wise and prudent and have revealed to them to babes. Even so, Father, it seemed good in your sight. And so as you're looking at that, first of all, you'll notice that Jesus begins with thankfulness and an acknowledgement of who God is. A great place to begin. Now, some people, and I've read some neo-atheists that really get kind of bugged over this whole thing, and they say, well, is God some sort of glory hound that he needs to be constantly praised? What is with God demanding praise? First of all, praise and acknowledgement of who God is gives us the proper perspective. Without that perspective, we're operating off of a finite temporal perspective. And so the first thing is that it takes our eyes off of us and it puts them on the greater picture. So, and that is really important. Two, it is God's proper place to be acknowledged because of who he is. It's not a matter of God needing it. It's a matter of it is right and just and good for God to be acknowledged as the source of all good because he is, and it is just because he is worthy of that acknowledgement. So that's where we're looking at here. And so there are good reasons for God demanding our praise. Some of those good reasons have to do with, or it's really good for us to acknowledge who he is. The other thing is that it is just and proper to acknowledge the truth. When we don't acknowledge who God is, we are not acknowledging the truth. So the answer to the atheist is God is not a hungry hound that uh, that needs our praise. He is a loving and just God that knows it is best for us and proper towards him. There's also an acceptance here. Jesus could have thought, well, why not reveal it to the wise and prudent? Babes there is not a reference to the age of the disciples, as if he's commenting on them being extremely young in age. Babes has to do with both innocence and uh, not being full of knowledge, not necessarily knowing everything. They're babes. They're beginners in that sense. And so Jesus' preparation for the upcoming uh, controversy is to acknowledge God. Great way to go into spiritual battle. And to accept the fact that God seemed fit to display himself to these gentlemen instead of necessarily the ones he could have. So there's an acceptance of God's will there. You want to be in that position too. Which you do not acknowledge out of God's will could become the very thing that the enemy wants to use. And so that's pretty good. Okay, we've got somebody here I got to say hi to. There's a name I don't recognize, but that's great. Let me throw a quick hi out there and try this. It is wonderful there. Okay. I think someone is giving me the Greek in transliteration. So glad to have you aboard. Okay. Let's keep going. All things have been delivered. Now, I want you to notice this. Jesus restates his position and his mission. See the rhyme there? His position and his mission. Not a perfect rhyme, but there's a little bit of back alliteration there. Jesus is fully aware of who he is and what he is to do. All things have been delivered to me by my Father. That is Jesus' position. He is the revealer. He is the one through whom the Father has chosen to exegete himself. If you go to John, um, the word actually used in the text about Jesus and being the one through whom the Father reveals himself, he has explained to us the Father. He has exegeted the Father to us, and Jesus is the one who does that. Now, I'm going to make some statements. They're not dogmatic, but they are patterns that seem to appear to me as far as Scripture. And so I'm a pattern attention payer. It seems that when I look at the work of how the Trinity works, we call this the economic Trinity, the relationship between the persons in the Godhead. Um, um, there seems to be a pattern. We can see it in Ephesians. We can see it in other places. We can see how the Godhead seems to relate within itself as far as the functions that each person has. The ontological Trinity refers to the relationship of God within himself, within his persons, prior to creation. The economic Trinity refers to how God works in terms of relating to his universe with each other inside himself. It seems as though the Father is the architect and planner, the Son is the executor, and the Spirit is the applier. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pattern that just seems to hold incredibly true. And I think God's giving us some clues about how things work and how he relates within himself to his creation. And that's very gracious of him. And it also gives us some insight that is really neat. It is helpful for us in terms of understanding difference in roles, but not difference in value. Husband and wife have different roles, but they don't have differences in value. They're equal in value before God, but he does seem to differentiate man from woman. And so when I was in mental health, one woman objected to that. And I could go back to the Trinity and say that such things do exist. Um, so, um, we're here. No one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son. Notice, and I don't have the Greek up here at the time, but here's what I want to go ahead and say about that. As we look at that, if you were to look at that, okay, you would see that Jesus is making a claim related to his mission. His mission is to display the Father. Someone asked if I'm a complementarianist or egalitarianist. Oh, wow. I tend towards complementarianism because I see mutual submission within the Trinity. I don't believe that submission, if it is voluntarily offered in love, is an evil thing. I think what man does with submission in his sinful nature is horrible. So I lean towards a complementarian position, believing that within the Godhead, the Son submitted to the Father, and yet I don't think Jesus is worth any less as co-eternal, co-equal, and sharing the same essence with the Father. And it seems as though the Spirit submits to the Father and Son. So I think God is teaching us something about the difference between loving voluntary submission with mutual goals. And I think it's a worthy lesson for me to learn and others to learn too. Here's what I don't believe in dictatorialism. And so that's the way I'm going to handle that. It may not make me the most popular guy in the world. Egalitarianism seems to be the view that a lot of people like. But as I explained to this woman in mental health when she loudly announced that Jeff doesn't believe men and women are equal because she knew my view, I said, well, here's my question. When you drink soup, do you use a fork? And when you eat a salad, do you use a spoon? And she said, well, no. And I said, well, I consider spoons and forks equal in value, don't you? Do you have a reason to consider one more valuable than the other? Yet they serve different functions. So that's my long and short of it. My dear sisters in the Lord are absolutely wonderful, and there's some things they can do that I can't. I was with my wife when she gave birth to my children, and guys and folks, I'll tell you, I don't think I want to go through that. I don't think I do real well with it either. My wife says that I can be a lousy patient. So that is just my take. But since the question was asked, it was in relation to position and mission. I think we've got that. Jesus is the one who reveals the Father. Why is it important he remember his mission and position? Because he's going to face opposition. When you face opposition, you must remember your position and your mission. There's a refrigerator magnet saying. This is one of Jeff Cran's refrigerator magnet sayings. When you face opposition, you must remember your position and your mission, because that's going to give you the strength to withstand the opposition. Okay? If you know who you are and what you're to be about, then you can withstand the opposition, at least overall. So Jesus is focused on who he is and what he's about. And he is the one who reveals the Father. Let's keep moving. Jesus is going to go ahead and give a call out to those who are surrounding him, who can hear this, okay? And let's look at this here. Remember at the beginning, in 20, he had started to rebuke the cities that did not accept him. And he is letting folks know that there's a cost. And so Jesus issues this call, come to me. By the way, it's not a suggestion. It's an imperative. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So that's Jesus's call. What is evangelism? Calling people to come to Jesus. Okay? Now, I work with a lot of street evangelists who I deeply respect. I love working with them, but I when I was a young, right before I became a believer, I ended up uh, hearing a gentleman named Brother Jed. And I don't even know what Brother Jed's first name was. I don't know that it was Jed. He would come to campus and he would preach against shorts, perfume, lipstick, certain length colors, certain other things. I'm not telling you that I'm for a lot of makeup. What I'm telling you is that Brother Jed would focus on these issues. And many people were deriding Brother Jed, and he felt he was convicting people of sin. Now, he may have convicted some people of sin, but I think he was making people angry because he was trying to create some sort of very superficial sin list and nail people between the eyes with a sin list. And he thought that that was the best way for them to be convicted. I have reason to believe that's not the best way to make people feel convicted. Who is it who convicts people? If people are convicted, it's not because of my or your brilliant recitation of their sins. Okay, I just don't believe that. Now, why don't I believe that? Well, because I've read John 16, 7 and 8. Nevertheless, I tell you, it is to your advantage I go away. Now, this is prior to Jesus' ascension. For if I do not go away, the helper will not come. That's a reference not to Muhammad, but to the Spirit. By the way, I will let you know an interesting retort. The Muslim will say that the Spirit, the helper, is Muhammad. The word spirit is neuter, so I asked, when did Muhammad get neutered? It's not. It's the Spirit. The helper will come to you, but if I depart, sorry, will not come to you, but if I depart, I will send him to you. And when he comes, what will the Spirit do? Let's understand what the Spirit will do according to John 16. He may do other things, but what does John 16 tell me that he will do? Okay, when he comes, he will convict the world of sin and of righteousness and of judgment. Wow. Um, so the Spirit seems to have the job of convicting people of sin and righteousness and judgment, if I've got this right. The Spirit is the one who convicts people. I'm not the Spirit. So I'm to call people to come to Jesus, and I'm to tell them that there's a reason they should come to Jesus, but it is not my job to convict people of sin. The Word of God is used by the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of God convicts people of sin. And so I'm not really big into figuring out the best sin list to shout at people. Yes, I have done street preaching. Hopefully, I will get to do it again. But I want to tell them the story of Jesus. I want to tell them the story of God's love. I want to tell them that all of us have fallen short. And if you're honest with yourself, you all knew something good to do and you didn't do it at one point in your life. And you probably knew some things you shouldn't do, and you know that at some point in your life you did them. And I don't know what things you did do or you didn't do, but you know what? You do know what things you did do and didn't do. And God knows what things you did do and didn't do. And I can't guess what they are. Um, and so I want to tell them about Jesus and their need, but I don't want to come up with a clever sin list and try to play name their sin. I once had a gentleman who told me he didn't sin. We went over a bunch of sins. He told me he didn't feel those things were sin. And I hit him with, have you ever known something good to do and did not do it? And he said, yes. And I said, well, he who knows what good to do and does not do it, it is sin to him. I don't have to tell you what sin is. You just told me what your sin was. Whatever good thing you were supposed to do that you neglected, you know what that thing is, and now you're accountable for it. So, how did the apostles deal with this? Well, let's look at the apostles sharing. How did they end up calling people to Jesus? By the way, I think a good way, don't just try to take Paul's words, men of Israel and men of Judea, because you might be in New York City and that's not going to work so well. But you can learn a little bit from looking at how they did this. Now, this is a Jewish audience, so this is a little bit more applicable. Um, Men and brethren, families of Abraham. Remember, he's talking to a Jewish audience in Judea. Uh, those among you who fear God, to you the word of salvation has been sent. Those who dwell in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not know, or even the voices of the know him, or even the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, have fulfilled them in condemning him. Though they found no cause for death in him, referring to Jesus, they asked Pilate that he should be put to death. Now, when they had fulfilled all that was written concerning him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb, but God has raised him from the dead. So the focus there is not naming their individual sins, but pointing out that they did not accept the one who was sent to them. Now, that works really well with that audience because they had a prophet, and they had the prophets and they had Moses to testify to them. Okay. As I said, I don't try to yell sin lists. I try to yell love. I try to tell them that they were created to be image bearers and they will never know their purpose in life or the satisfaction that that purpose can bring if they do not know Jesus. There's a poem I remember. The saddest words of tongue and pen are these three words, it might have been. Uh, Again, we don't convict people. And we don't even know how to best convict people. I think God knows people's hearts even far better than I do. So, um, by the way, if someone says they've kept the Ten Commandments explain the great two commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The big question that I like to ask people is, even if you did everything right, did you do it solely for the love of God? That might have been in there because you might be a religious person or zealous for God, but did you do it solely for the love of God? Did you love virtue for virtue's sake alone? And most people will admit that there might have been some other reason alongside that. So if you're not loving God and loving your neighbor, you've blown the 10 because you blew the 2. But I'll be interested in the conversation that appears as to what people told the gentleman who thought he had made it. Let's talk about the yoke, though. Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light. What type of yoke are we talking about? How do we put on Jesus' yoke? How do we understand a yoke? We don't even use yokes anymore. So let's see what a yoke was and what it came to mean in Jesus' day. Let's dig into when they heard that Jesus' yoke was easy, what were they thinking about as far as yoke? Well, we know what it was physically. It was a wooden collar that joined two animals together, usually oxen, because oxen were used to plow and to uh, drag or carry great weights or carry a cart. And in order to get the two oxen to work together, you would yoke them so that you would go ahead and do that. And so you'd have the power of both animals linked in some sort of synchronicity so that their power was working together to get the job done. Um, it could be used of subjugation, the yoke of Babylon, because the yoke on the animals really put them at your service. Um, However, it also was used to be bound to someone in terms of covenant partnership or to be bound to a purpose that someone else had. You were yoked with them. Paul uses a Greek word that has the idea of yoke fellows. Okay, and it's really one Greek word formed of two, and he was talking about being partners, having the same purpose and working together, being connected together and working in some sort of tandem for the same purpose or together for the same purpose. Now, in this sense, we are God's yoke covenant partners, so we are yoked to God. I'm not the first person to say that. You'll find Martin Manzer in his Dictionary of Bible Themes, which is in Logos, that has this nice article on yoking. But it came to mean something to the Jewish person in particular. Uh, Now, the Hebrew is up there, and for me to read it, I'm going to have to make it bigger. I don't know what that's going to do to your screen. I'm going to pull up closer because I'm always dealing with the vowel pointings, okay? Kival, and there's no vowel pointing there. Uh, and so you have the word for yoke, probably alol, but there's no vowel pointing. So I'm stuck as to whether that's a vav or a vowel. Melchut Shemaim. Now, see, I didn't need the vowel pointings for that. Um, and I could almost figure out the vowel pointings for the other words. You can do that with Hebrew. But what you have is the yoke of the kingdom of heaven is the idea there. Okay, and that's accepting the yoke of the kingdom of God. To acknowledge God as one's king and Lord. Now, that's the picture of God that I had even before I was saved. I pictured God in terms of being my rightful king, my king, and I was supposed to end up submitting to him. Now, admittedly, in my sinful nature, I could not submit to him in the way that I should because I was broken and corrupted by sin. I, like others, was zealous for God, yet without knowledge, and in trying to live in some way apart from his righteousness, obviously I ended up in a position of depending on mine in some way. Um, and so, sincere, but ignorant of the righteousness of God. But I did view God as my king, my rightful king. And so that's a very Jewish concept to acknowledge God as one's kings and Lord, to acknowledge the one God as the king, and to forswear all other gods. You know, I understand. The expression thus serves to denote monotheism of Judaism as daily declared by every adherent of the Jewish faith in the Shema. Now, I know that's long, okay, but the key thing here is that the Shema began to be known as the yoke of the kingdom. So the rabbi said that when one is reciting the Shema, one is taking on the yoke of the kingdom. And I think I've shared that reference in a tractate called Berachot, which is about prayer and the blessings. Okay. So that's kind of what it meant. So for Jewish people, the idea of yoke uh, went to the idea of being a covenant partner with God and being under his authority or accepting his authority, the authority of the kingdom of heaven, accepting God's authority over you in your life, making or at least acknowledging that your right allegiance, your correct allegiance should be to God and God alone. What do we do with this yoke being light? Why is it light? Is it easy to do everything God says? No. Light is not the best translation, as pointed out by A.T. Robinson in his word pictures in the New Testament, as far as the way we translate light. See, usually light is translated as easy in many Bible versions. My yoke is easy and my burden is light, is the way some translations have it. And that's not really the best way to understand that. So I want to get rid of the easy, because it's not always easy to follow Jesus. Easy is really a poor translation, as A.T. Robinson points out. Moffat puts it kindly. Now, that's an interesting thing. We went from easy to kindly. My version reads, take my yoke upon you and, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. My yoke is easy. See, the New King James does the easy thing. If you're wondering where we're in verse 30, right at the end of the pericope. And easy is not a good version. And so Moffat points this out. Kindly is really fascinating. How do we get from easy to kindly? That is the meaning of the word in the Septuagint for persons. We have no adjective that quite carries the notion of kindly and good. Now understand that. Even in our English translations, sometimes it is hard to find an English word that captures the fullness of the Greek or Hebrew word. The key example to me is chesed. Chesed is this incredible Hebrew word that's translated several different ways in your English Bible because it is very hard to catch the meaning of it. So this has the idea of being good and kind. The yoke of Christ is useful, good, and kind. So when Jesus says this, he says, take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Why will you find rest for your souls? Since my yoke is good and kind, and my burden is light. The difference here is that when we take Jesus' yoke upon us, Jesus cares for us. He's not an unkind, cruel, despotic master. He is a master who deeply loves us, wants the best for us, and wants us to be able to be what God created us to be, to express the full measure of being an image bearer of God in a unique way. To be truly human as who you were meant to be, and to use all God put in you for the good cause of the kingdom. And so Jesus' yoke is not burdensome in the sense of being harsh or ill-fitting. It's a key concept with a yoke. Okay, if you made the yoke wrong, it wouldn't fit the two animals rightly. And so as the animals were working, their necks would get all chafed and scratched up and worn. And see, this is not, Jesus's yoke is proper fitting. It does not scratch our neck. It does not chafe us. It does not rub our skin away. It is difficult, but it is a well-fitting yoke. It is a yoke that fits well, that is useful and good. Well, having done all this and calling people to himself and telling them that they will find genuine rest, we're going to see what genuine rest didn't exist. What type of genuine rest is Jesus talking about? Taking an all-expense paid vacation to Club Med? No, that's not the sort of rest he's talking about. And the controversy will come, and you will see the heart of God in contrast to the Pharisees, and in a sense, you will get an idea of the rest that Jesus is offering by contrast in this controversy. So the controversy begins to come in relation to the Sabbath in Matthew 12, 1 through 4. Now, I'm not saying that this is chronological. I'm saying that when Matthew frames this controversy, he frames it in terms of the Sabbath, which is a real big issue for these guys. Okay? And, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that they loved him before either. All right? Jesus has already been questioned by John's disciples as far as his followers' view of fasting. So he's already gotten a little bit of kickback from John's disciples. This is going to be a major brouhaha here. This is going to be a major problem here. The Sabbath became a big thing. Let me tell you why the Sabbath became such a big thing. During the period of the Maccabees, there was intense pressure to Hellenize, to accept the worship of the Greeks alongside the worship of God. And so there was tremendous pressure under Antiochus Epiphanes to accept him as deity and accept the Hellenistic or Greek way of life. And so there was a real pressure to figure out how to deal with this. The three markers that became really important for as indications of faithfulness to God during that time period and even Jewish identity was keeping kosher, the Sabbath, and circumcision of males at the proper time. Okay, and those became three major biggies. Particularly for adults, the keeping of the kosher laws and the Sabbath became markers during that persecution of the desire and the outright seriousness about remaining faithful to God. I will demonstrate that I'm not going to buy your Hellenism. Okay. Good question from Radical Love. If you can stay with me, I'll double back to it because she's asking about the word chesed, and I love the word chesed. I'm a chesed kind of guy. That's a key concept for me. And she's asking anyone else, so you can chime in. This was a key controversy, and so the Sabbath is going to be a big thing because it's a marker. Okay, it's a loyalty marker. Now, let me be real clear here. I'm going to read Matthew 12, 1 through 8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And he said, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, only the priests? Or have you not read the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple, for you had not, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, we're not going to pack all that tonight, probably. This is incredibly large, and there's some implications as far as deity in this. But let me explain how the Sabbath worked. Now, I told you it was loyalty, but how do I know what work is on the Sabbath? The rabbis were terribly worried about this whole thing, and Pirkei Avot says that one of the things you're supposed to do is build a fence around the law. Not really a good idea, but remember, they came back from Babylon, and so they were terribly worried about sinning against God and being exiled somewhere worse, which, by the way, the diaspora happened and the Jewish people did get exiled. So they wanted to forestall any sort of judgment by God. So they said, we'll not only keep the rules, but one of the key things we're going to enforce is keeping a fence around the law. This is the idea of halacha, how we walk, how we practice. This is still true today. And so that's Orthodox Judaism. That's Rabbinical Judaism. That's Rabbi Singer. The law and then the fence around the law. And so on one hand, he's very big that God will just forgive you because he's a nice God and if you're kind of sorry. And on the other hand, he has all these rules that you're supposed to follow in order to be a nice person and be sorry so that God is a nice God will forgive you. Do you get the kind of conflict here? He's advocating a very burdensome system, and then he's advocating a God that will look the other way at the same time. How did the rabbis figure this out? It's the word for generations, toldot. My dictation software does not like the word toldot, so it put told old, but you'll see toldot above. I'm continue to have to train theological terms into Dragon, naturally speaking, especially because there are a lot of Jewish terms. So that is toldot when Dragon, naturally speaking, decided not to accept the training. I will deal with Dragon, naturally speaking, and reinforce toldot over told old, or generations. Okay? The word toldot literally means generations. So the rabbi said, how do we know if we're working? Well, here's how we know if we're working. We look at the functions that occurred in the tabernacle and temple, and then we extrapolate out what type of functions these were, and then any function connected with the tabernacle and the types of work doing with the tabernacle are going to be forbidden on the Sabbath. So if the priest carried wood, you can't carry anything. If the priest lit a fire, you can't light a fire. And so they created this toldot of the Sabbath, these collection of things, or the word toldot has the idea of generations, but these extensions of the things done in the tabernacle that could not be done on the Sabbath. So you have 613 commandments, and then you have about another 600 related to what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. Now remember what Jesus said, his yoke is not burdensome. It's kind and good. This is a heavy yoke. This is a heavy yoke. You have to light the candles 18 minutes before the Sabbath and not on the Sabbath. What if you're 15 minutes? Well, then you didn't light them exactly on time. This is the sort of thing we're dealing with, and it resulted in dozens of complicated Sabbath rules. Heavy. Jesus is going to complain about this. Now, the disciples, that's all they could see were their rigid little rules. Their rigid little rules and their rigid little traditions. And it's all they saw was the disciples violated the rules. That's it. That's all they could see is the disciples violated the rules. How dare they violate the rules and desecrate the Sabbath? The Sabbath is vital. The Sabbath is a mark of loyalty to God. How dare they do this? What the disciples and Jesus, the disciples knew they were hungry. Jesus knew they hadn't gotten any nourishment. And it's not like they were sitting home eating popcorn just before they left with Jesus. They had been walking around. They had been out all day. The climate there is probably during the daytime parts of the year similar to the climate in Arizona. They were really in need of nourishment. But the disciples don't care. They don't care about the disciples. The Pharisees don't care about the disciples needing nourishment. Too bad for you. They only saw their little rules. I remember this story of a gal who was at a congregation. Good question. Can I get to that? Someone asked about servants and why Jews hire a Sabbath goy, and I want to get to that. So please hang out. If you can't, just let me know, and I'll do that early. But I really want to take a little bit of time with that. Because it gets into a really interesting point about Jewish law. I hope you guys can still see me. If you can't, let me know. A little weird error thing came up, and I don't know what it means. Okay. And so I'm hoping everything's working out okay. Said something about keyframe frequency. So I'm hoping this fixes itself here. They needed nourishment. The Pharisees are really bugged over this violation. And this tells me about the heart of the Pharisees. They don't care about the disciples. They don't care about people. They care that the little rules are uh, accepted. Now, Jesus is going to use a device in rabbinical reasoning. Girza shva. Okay, I may be mispronouncing it a little. Okay, and so this was a rabbinical type of argument device, a way of making a point, a way of saying that something was lawful, or that something really was okay. And so he uses their own reasoning in Scripture to demonstrate the poverty of their hearts. They should have been concerned about fellow image bearers. They were concerned about their rules. And Jesus is going to use one of their own principles to do it. What is this principle? The application of laws from one instance to a second instance to achieve a unified legal principle. We call it the law of precedent. And it's very similar to that. Okay? So let's look at what Jesus is using. Let's understand this because there's a cross reference to what David did in Samuel. And if you don't understand this cross reference, you're not going to see how brilliant this biblical legal argument is. And I want you to see how brilliant it is, okay? Jesus said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? What did David do when he was hungry? What did those with him do when he was hungry?" Now, I'm hoping you can see stuff. I've got my screen, up here. But I'm going to read for you Samuel 21, 1 through 6, so you can see what David did. Okay? Now, David came to Nob to, I want to say Abimelech, but it's not. It's Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone? See, what are you doing here? Are you really doing something that's kosher here? Why is no one with you?" And David said to Ahimelech, the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I sent you or what I've commanded you.'" Now, David's actually fleeing at this point, and that's not true. Okay, so you can get David for shading the truth here. Okay, and someone's ahead of me, but that's okay, because I'm going to show you how eating the showbread, and Jesus is drawing this principle here. Okay. "And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now, therefore, when you have what you have on hand, give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, and whatever can be found." And the priest answered David and said, "We have no common bread," that means no bread that was not ceremonial or show bread, "on hand." And David answered the priest and said to him, "Truly, women have been kept from us for 3 days since I've come out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it has been consecrated in the vessel of the day." The priest gave him the holy bread, that's the showbread, for there was no bread but the showbread which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Now, the showbread would be rotated. So the showbread would be up there, and the old showbread would be taken off, and new showbread would be put up there. Now, that represented the manna, or God's provision. How ironic is that? And so the old showbread was given to David, because the old showbread had just been exchanged, or had been exchanged for the new showbread. But the showbread was still considered holy. And so David says, well, first of all, we are not in a state of ceremonial uncleanness. Now, I know that gets complicated, but there were laws around ceremonial cleanness. They involved intimate relations. And so David says, the men are not ceremonially unclean, and neither am I. That's the point he's making. And so he is given the showbread. But Jesus, how does that help your argument? How does that, big deal? What does that mean? Why are you pointing this out? Well, let's see Jesus's brilliant argument here. Okay. Jesus is applying or drawing a principle, law president, Girza, from one passage to another passage. And he's saying, well, look at this passage and look at the situation here, and here's a legal principle. Okay? Why was David allowed to eat the showbread by the priest and the men with him? Because the priest thought or considered David being on God's business. If you were on King Saul's business, okay, it was as though you were on God's business. Now we know there's a problem with that, okay, because Saul wasn't so cool, all right. But hypothetically, in this monarchy that was a theocratic monarchy, if you were on the king's business, you should have been, or you were considered to be on God's business. That doesn't work so well later on, but that has to do with the kings of Israel and their lack of faithfulness. It doesn't have to do with the fact that that's the way it should have been. So, David was allowed to eat the showbread by the priest because the priest considered David being on God's business. Jesus is stating that the principle applies that when you're on God's business, okay, you are freed from other considerations that hamper God's business which you're on, including prohibitions related to ceremony, or certain ceremonial prohibitions is a better way to put it. So, the disciples are on God's business. David's men were on God's business, so they should equally be allowed to take nourishment by means of picking the grain. That's the point. The legal precedent is you're freed from certain ceremonial restrictions and allowed to take nourishment if you are on God's business. David's men were allowed to take nourishment even though it violated certain ceremonial things. My disciples are in God's business, even though it violates certain ceremonial things. They are allowed to take nourishment. Do you see the brilliant argument that Jesus is doing? He's drawing a principle from the incident with David, and he's applying it to his disciples and saying, by the law precedent, by Girza, it is lawful for them to do this. Your reasoning, gentlemen, your principle of drawing legal decisions, gentlemen. Now I'm applying it to my disciples. I'm using a perfectly acceptable type of Jewish argument that you yourself acknowledge according to your method of legal argumentation is okay. Jesus has got a second illustration. Matthew 12:4-5. Okay. Have you not read in the law, see the bold there, on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? What is he saying? How do the priests profane the Sabbath? Well, they're doing things that according to the Toldot, which are placed on everyone else, they couldn't do. They're lighting a fire, but you're not allowed to light a fire on the Sabbath. But the priests had to light a fire. There were offerings, and they had to keep a fire going. And so how could they do this? They were working, cutting up animals, working. But you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to carry things certain distances, but yet they carried things. So the priests are, in a sense, doing things not allowed on the Sabbath according to what the Pharisees understood, yet they're not considered guilty. So he's going to set up his second argument here. Okay? And he starts with the priests, that they're able to do things that are considered work in the service of Israel and the worship of God, set up for Israel, that's the her, through the tabernacle. The priests are allowed to do things that are considered work that are not allowed on the Sabbath in the service of Israel and the worship of God through the system God himself set up. Wow. How does this work? What does this mean? Okay, Jesus, so what are you telling us here? I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. Ooh, this is a kol v'chomer argument. Okay, light to heavy, heavy to light. If this is true of the lighter thing, the actual tabernacle, how much truer is it of my disciples who are serving the greater temple or tabernacle of God? The priests could do it. They were violating the Sabbath. My disciples are doing the service of God in relationship to the greater tabernacle. And it's a how much more argument. Is this true for the priests? This is so much more true for my disciples. Back off, guys. Just back it right off. You are out of line. You do not understand what you are saying and what you are doing. You're just totally out of line. So let's start to wrap this up. Okay. Let's do the conclusions, and then I have a question about how Orthodox Jews have Sabbath Gentiles and why that doesn't violate the law. The laws, God's laws, are not about rule keeping, but rather about manifesting the character of God as an image bearer. God's laws are about manifesting God as an image bearer, not about some sort of legal little checklist. Checklist spirituality is not what God's after. Okay? When we use these as some sort of checklist, we enter legalism and we miss the point. While we're not taking pictures of, okay, we're not taking pictures of men and calling down lists of their sins. We are those called to come to Jesus and to tell other people to come to Jesus. Legalistic presentations of the gospel can be out of step with the gospel itself. You follow what I'm saying? If I present the gospel in a non-gospel manner, I'm no longer presenting the gospel. And if I present the gospel legalistically, I'm not really presenting the gospel the way it needs to be presented. So we need to be careful of Brother Jed. Did God use Brother Jed? Yes. Was he sincere? Yes. Did he do a tremendous amount of damage? Yeah. A lot of people did not want to come to Jesus because they had to go through Brother Jed first. And that is a sad thing. So hopefully you got some good material about Jewish legal thinking, about the arguments Jesus used, about the way he approached his first conflict. Let's deal with some questions. Why do Orthodox Jews hire Gentiles to light their fires? This is the term Sabbath goy that we're talking about here. This is the term Sabbath goy that we're talking about here. Yes, I will get to the meaning of chesed. Jewish people do not regard the law as being for the nations. They talk about the Noahide laws that were given to Noah. They do not feel that the law is necessarily incumbent on the nations necessarily as far as being righteous. They need to deal with the light that they have. They have light through Noah. There are some the Noahide laws, and so one can be a righteous Gentile in terms of the Noahide laws, which would require monotheism and some other things. Great job typing the word chesed. Let's talk about the meaning of chesed. The meaning of chesed is translated love, loving kindness, mercy, grace. There's a separate word that's translated grace. It's the word chen. It's the word we get Hannah from. If you know any Hannahs or Annas, it's chana. Chana. And it's a female form of chen. The word chen means to stoop down. Now, chesed is a complicated word. It combines the idea of love, kindness, and loyalty. It's best translated covenant loyalty. One of my values that I really love that resonates with me is the value of loyalty. Another concept that really resonates with me, and it's a scriptural concept, but it's a very Jewish concept, and it's something that resonates with me from my background in a very personal way, is the concept of covenant. And chesed is a combination that has the idea of covenant loyalty. So when you see chesed, think covenant loyalty. When you see chen, okay, it means to stoop down when a greater is stooping down to someone who is lesser in position. Chen is being practiced. The coolest picture of chen is a parent or an adult stooping down to listen to or to help a child. He's practicing chen, condescension. In the case of chesed, it's covenant loyalty. So that's a concept that really resonates with me from my background in a very deep and personal way. And we need to be people of chesed. We need to be people of covenant loyalty to God and to others. And so that's where we are with Matthew this evening. You can see the cool background, and I intend to do more of this. I may leave that background up occasionally. Maybe God will move me to use a different background, but I'm excited. You have heard Matthew taught with the backdrop of the area where Matthew occurred. So that has been a fun night. Just a little side note, a dear brother who is going to be more than just a brother is actually using my video, I think, for the class, or telling people to go to the video I did for the in relation to the class he's doing, teaching he's doing on Wednesday nights on eschatology. So I'm really kind of excited about that. That just a little added benefit. The material was useful to a dear brother and a young man that I've had a hand in, and so I'm really excited about that. Well, that's enough of that, but it's fun to see God do stuff with stuff and bring fruit forward, and so I just get excited all over. And you guys are great too. Uh, so I'm excited. I saw a few folks I hadn't seen for a while. I've seen folks I love to see on a regular basis. And thank you for the positive feedback. It motivates me, not in terms of being, I don't know how to put it, but when I know that God's going to take material that he's working through me to produce, then I get excited because I know he's going to multiply the bread and the fish of it, and so that's really cool. I'm going to go ahead. It's really warming up in the office right now, so I should put a fan on and drink some water because I'm beginning to feel like beef jerky. So I just want to, oops, well, huh, my mouse is out of the house. And just a shout out, radical love. That is the spirit of Torah. Those are the two great commandments. And so she is just restating, they're just being restated for us. And that's where it's all at. So we will continue to see the Pharisees pick on Jesus and see Jesus's reply to this whole Sabbath issue. And we'll look to whether we can heal on the Sabbath. So there you go. And we'll move from there into the next pericope.